everyone. It's nice to see you. Hi. So we're talking about a story that a lot of you are very familiar with, or we think we're familiar with it. There are a lot of things in Torah that we think we're familiar with, like we think that the animals came on the ark 2 by 2, right? That's something that we just accept, that that's what the Torah says, when in fact the Torah says that some of them came on 2 by 2, but all the kosher animals came on by 7s. But you never see that. You don't get 7 cows when you buy a Noah's Ark set for your kids or grandkids. So there are a lot of things that we think we know, a lot of those stories, and I think this is one of those interesting stories that we accept Solomon's wisdom in the story, and I'd like us to look at it, see his wisdom, and also potentially challenge it and think about how we might have behaved in this particular situation. I wish that I had put together a PowerPoint presentation with all of the art that depicts this particular story. Now, if you've seen art that depicts this story with the 2 women before Solomon, both of them claiming that the baby is their baby, how do you usually picture Solomon? Regally. Okay, great. Yes. Listening. Most of the images, the art that I've seen, portrays him as having a white beard, as being older, right? And it's interesting because in the text, Solomon becomes king at age 12. And this is his first judgment. Now, it's after he's already married the daughter of Pharaoh, but he can marry at 12. Kings can marry at any age, pretty much. And he's also already built his temple. So it's not clear exactly did he become a judge much later. So you can make an argument either way. He died at 52 years old, so he reigned for 40 years. 40 years of peace and prosperity, was considered a great king. But he didn't live, that image that we have of that old, wise, long white beard is not necessarily Solomon. And then the women, when you picture these women, just from up here, not from studying the text, who do you picture these women being? I just want to kind of flesh them out a little bit before we actually meet them. Our stereotypes, our projections of who they are.
Lower class.
Okay, good. Yes, lower class.
I know in the text it says that they're prostitutes, but the way I was taught is they're just women that children.
Great. Okay. So it's a question. The text says that they're prostitutes. It's not. The story isn't often taught because we tell the story in religious schools. We don't always talk about that they were prostitutes. But that's actually potentially a significant part of the story. Now, if we're trying to get, there are different ways to look at the story. If you look at the very last line on the flip side of your text, you have the chapter here, chapter 3 from 1 Kings. The very last line of the text says, "When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe, because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice." Now, the Hebrew for that last part, divine wisdom to administer justice, is chokhmat Elohim la'asot mishpat. So it's a wisdom from Elohim to do mishpat, justice. Now, just to put a setting on the story, just as a set induction for talking about this story, there are 2 primary names of God that we find in Torah. We find Elohim and we find Adonai. And there are many rabbis who write about each of those names being different manifestations of an aspect of God. So Elohim is generally understood to be God's judgment, right? God as judge. You have who creates the world. It's Bereshit bara Elohim. Elohim is the creator of the world. Who asks Abraham to sacrifice his son? Elohim does. But who stops Abraham from killing his son? It's Malach Adonai. It's an angel of Adonai. Adonai is often understood as God's mercy or God's heart, God's feeling for mankind. But Elohim is that aspect of God that predates human history, that creates the world, creates planets that collide, earthquakes, car accidents, disease. That aspect of God doesn't really care. It's the God of evolution. It's the God of change, of time. Part of God that was here long before we came and will be here long after, and doesn't have any real relationship to us. In fact, the first chapter of Genesis is all Elohim, and it's not until the creation of man that you see Elohim Adonai. You see Elohim and Adonai together. And so that part of God, Adonai, is the part that is attached to us, is that part that cries with us, that we pray to, that hears our prayers, mercy. So the particular kind of wisdom that Solomon has, according to the text, is Chochmat Elohim la'asot mishpat. It's the wisdom of judgment, right? To discern, to understand justice. However, just want to challenge us to imagine what would this story look like. The end of the story is good, so it's not that we want to change how Solomon is wise and much wiser than anyone who's ever walked on the earth, so who are we to challenge him? However, what would Chochmat Adonai la'asot chesed look like, right? So what would divine Adonai wisdom to do mercy look like in this story? So we just want to keep that in the back of our minds. There are two ways to look at this story at all times. And the same in any story in court, right? There's the judge looking at the story and looking for the facts and the guilty versus the innocent. And then there's also that aspect of the story where, maybe the therapist looking at the story. What's the greater context here? People are guilty, nations are guilty, history has sin in it, only depending on where you start the story, right? If you choose to start the story, in the Middle East in the 20th century, it's one story. But if you start in the 19th century or the 18th century or the 15th century, it keeps changing. So I want to keep those two concepts of wisdom in our mind as we start to look at this story. So King Solomon was born in 848 BCE, so a long time ago. So I just want to put us in the context of where we are. This is Solomon's first court decision, and let's just get a little taste of who Solomon is before we get to meet these women, illustrated here. So if you turn back to the first page, in verse 5, it says, "At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, 'Ask for whatever you want me to give you.' So Solomon answered, 'Anything you want, you can have.' Solomon answered, 'You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child.'" Now, is he 12? Is he 15? Is he 17? Is he 20? We're not sure. "I'm only a little child. I do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart." And the Hebrew is a lev shomea, a listening heart. Give your servant a listening. That's an amazing thing to ask for when you're being offered anything. If you think about if you're offered anything, the numbers for the next Powerball or the last Powerball, right? Anything at all, to actually ask for a certain kind of heart, right? Not the power of invisibility or flight, not wealth, not longevity, not even happiness, but an understanding, listening heart. And a listening heart to do what? To govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. And God is so pleased that this is what Solomon asked for, that God says, since you've asked for this and not for longevity or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for. So he gets it all, riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among the kings. So Solomon's very wise, and there are a lot of stories about his wisdom. There's this great story that the Queen of Sheba comes to test she's heard how wise he is, and she comes to test him. And she brings artificial flowers and real flowers and says, pick which one is real. And he's able to pick it. I think that he watches a bee and the pattern of the bee around the flowers, and he can tell which one is real based on the bees. Some people say he can speak to the animals and the plants and the stars. He understands communicate with all strata of creation. There's a story that the Queen of Sheba actually asks him a riddle. What has 10 openings, and when one is open, 9 is closed? 9 are closed, but when 9 are closed, 1 is open. And instantly, Solomon knows that it's a human being, that when the human being is in the womb, a human being has 10 openings, eyes, nostrils, ears, mouth, navel, everything else, etc. And in the womb, the only one that's open is the navel. And then when we're born, the navel closes and everything else opens. So strangely, the Queen of Sheba does not go down in history as being incredibly clever for coming up with these awesome riddles, but Solomon, for solving them, does. So just a shout out to her. So now Solomon is now blessed with this lev shomea, this listening heart. He wakes up from his dream in verse 15, returns to Jerusalem, stood before the ark of the Lord's covenant, sacrificed burnt offerings, and then he gave a feast for all of his court. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. So, yes. Please. No, that's a really good question. It was not considered a long life. Yeah, it was not considered a long life. You know, it's really interesting when you talk about what it means to merit goodness in Judaism. And there's a section in Talmud that talks about that if you walk in God's ways, you can be guaranteed many blessings in your life. And except for 3 which are out of our control. And one of them is longevity. I think it's, longevity and perhaps, I'm not sure what the other 2 were, but they're big ones. So you're right, that is strange. David was 70 when he died. He also did not live long, not like the 930 that Adam lived, right? In fact, the rabbis say that Adam lived 930 years and not a full round 1,000 because he gave up 70 of his years so that David, the progenitor of the Messiah, would be able to be born. But it is an interesting question. Okay, so Solomon puts together this giant feast, and we have to imagine that because the text says now, that it's in the middle of this feast that these 2 prostitutes appear before him. So you want to just imagine that the juxtaposition between what these women look like, they're clearly uninvited to this feast, and the kind of lavish dress and accoutrements that are all around in this royal court. And somehow, to Solomon's credit and his court's credit, they let them in. And he accepts this moment as his first opportunity to judge. Rabbi Levi ben Gershom Rahav, the Ralbag, says that God brought the prostitutes as his first case to rein in his ego, to teach him that he would not only pronounce judgment on high officials, but on the salt of the earth as well. So that there was a reason that this is his particular case. It's women, it's not high male officials, and it's not only women, it's prostitutes, right? And it's about maternity. Okay, so we have these two women appearing before him. And so now this is where we really have to pay attention to this story. It's not a long story, but there's so much hidden in it. One of them said, "My Lord, this woman and I live in the same house." So let's just stop there for a second, because that's what the annoying thing that rabbis do. You think you're getting somewhere, and then you don't get anywhere. So first of all, calling her this woman. You know, we remember the famous "that woman." Yeah, this woman, that woman. It's kind of why do you do that? You know. Yes, yeah, it's derogatory, it diminishes their humanity. We can't possibly imagine that they don't know each other's names, right? So it even goes on to say, "My Lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me." This is real intimacy, right? They were together when she had this baby. "The third day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the two of us." So if we listen with that Chochmat Elohim la'asot mishpat, the wisdom of Solomon, and we hear the two of us were alone in the house, there was no one else with us. We're listening as a judge would listen. Why is that important?
There are no witnesses.
Great. There's no witnesses. Right? So now if we listen to those same words with Chochmat Adonai la'asot chesed, with that kind of merciful, maybe therapeutic ear, what are you also hearing? We were alone in the house, this woman and I. Yeah, there's no one to help. You're kind of hearing an incredible loneliness. I hear an incredible loneliness that is being spoken here. You have two women whose, you can dismiss that they're prostitutes, but let's think about what that means. That means that they live in this house that men are coming in and out of all the time, using them and abandoning them. We don't know who the fathers are of these children, right? They happen to be boys, male children, right? So we don't know who the father is of either of them. They might probably don't know. And so their experience, the only constant in each other's lives is one another, right? That sisterhood. Now, if you've ever watched documentaries or talked with women who have escaped from sex trafficking or from brothels, they talk about there is a kind of sisterhood between them. There is an incredible kind of family bond that is often formed between these women. Men, are not the constant. Men are using them, objectifying them, and leaving. And they are there together. So in that situation, for her to say this woman is really something really painful has happened. Yes?
Well, there's this very popular TV show, Orange is the New Black.
Yes, I love it.
And, one of the things that bothers me about that show and will stop me from watching it is that they are not a sisterhood.
That's interesting. Right.
They don't help one another. They
Right.
are mean to one another. And I found that very disturbing.
Yes, and it is disturbing. Sisterhood,
So
yeah.
women probably are left alone because the other women are very busy servicing other men. And so there's no one there to be with them.
So that's a really important comment. Sisterhood itself is a really complicated, there are dark female forces, right? And I say that as a woman. And what I mean by that is, in feminism, we talk about something called the male gaze, or often referred to as the societal gaze. And what that is that when women look at themselves, when you look at yourself in a mirror, the trick is to try to figure out how to see yourself through your own eyes. And that's a very hard thing to do because ever since we were born, we were trained to see ourselves through a societal gaze, right? And that's defined by men. So we look at ourselves and we look at each other and we dress for each other because we're looking at each other through male eyes, right? So we notice each other's bodies. We notice, most men will say, if a woman is naked, they're just so happy they're naked. They don't care about any of the stuff we care about. They're just like, oh my God, thank you for being naked. This is incredible, right? Whereas we're like, so like the lighting, the this, the that, the jiggle. We're just, because we've in a way internalized that male gaze even more than the men that, we spend time with. But so that whole notion of these two women seeing each other, are they competitors? That sisterhood is complicated because it's complicated by that natural, the natural competitiveness that our world encourages in us. Yes.
So are there men in that prison, or are they just?
Oh, on that show, the Orange is the New Black? No, there are male guards. There are male guards.
That's what causes that tension for them?
Well, the tension, I don't know. I mean, you have, yeah.
Talking about males and them doing all that kind of tension because of the males.
I'm talking about not even the presence of actual men. I'm talking about the internalized societal gaze that teaches women to look at themselves and look at each other and judge themselves and judge each other according to a standard that, there's actually a very famous article written by a Muslim woman, and her name escapes me, and it's all about the size 6 harem. That, in the Muslim world you have the concept of the physical harem, but in the Western world you have this concept of the size 6 harem, that women sort of put themselves in, that if you're anything but size 6, you don't feel comfortable, in this world. And it comes from inside, but it's been put there from the world that we are in. So so these women are from another world, right? They're biblical times, so it's a long time ago. But we imagine a couple of things. One, the first case that the king hears, again, like we said, are these two destitute women, poverty-stricken, they're not dressed like the others. They're very sad. And it's also a case of one woman's word against another. So something you could maybe even dismiss. In Jewish law, in Jewish law you have to have 2 witnesses to a crime. There was once a famous case in Israel where there was a Kohen married to a woman, and she was raped. Now, a Kohen traditionally can't remain married to somebody who has been with another man. And the way the court found a loophole is they said, because the rape wasn't witnessed except by yourself, and you're a woman, your testimony can be dismissed, and therefore you can remain married because there weren't witnesses. So, so you have a case of one woman's word against another. And in the grand scheme of what Solomon's doing, what does that matter? So we'll go a little bit deeper into it. So this one woman is saying, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. So they went through this pregnancy together. Just imagine how much they've shared, right? Who in the world understands each other the way they do. They've been through everything together. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the two of us. We were alone. There was no one in the world who understood us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. Yeah, that's the part, we don't remember this part of the story usually. Yeah. Okay, some do, yeah. Okay, so during the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side, while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, now remember they're 3 days apart, so maybe that also is significant in terms of how they look. I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. So even before we get to the kidnapping, right? You have a woman who must be wild with grief, right? Must be incredibly wild with grief. Do you remember a couple of years ago, there was a woman who fell asleep. She had been drinking vodka, and she passed out, and she suffocated her baby, right? And then Nancy Grace kept talking about her as vodka mom. She kept calling her vodka mom, and what a horrible mom. And the woman, while she was watching Nancy Grace, poured gasoline over herself and set herself on fire, right? So she was like sort of mocked on TV over and over again. And you can imagine, the kind of grief and guilt that was tearing her up inside, right? And so that's what this woman, that not only did this woman, have a baby and, is in that postpartum recovery period, but the baby's dead and she's responsible, right? So the state, maybe plead insanity, right? If you can plead affluenza, then maybe in this case we could plead, temporary insanity. Yes.
I never thought of prostitutes as having children.
Interesting, right? Yeah, that's interesting, right? I guess some do, right? Right. Yeah. Something got through, I guess. Yes.
When the dead baby, when the mother laid on him, is this by accident, by design, or do we know?
So that's
Because I know cases where you have large families, some of the children live with their mother, and there have been cases where the mother rolls over while asleep and
right.
smother the baby. But it was accidental, at least that's the story.
Yeah, so it seems accidental the way the story is, but the woman does exhibit a kind of cruelty later, because as the story goes on and the king says, let's cut the baby in two, she says, yes, let's do that, right? And so that's a kind of, all of a sudden you're exhibiting, and we need to talk about why she does that, why at that moment, because usually, if the other party in a court concedes to you, you take it, right? So if the other woman is saying, don't give her the baby, just give her the baby, don't cut the baby, whatever you do, give her the baby. It's strange that she doesn't then say, yes, give me the baby, right? Because she's won. So she does exhibit a kind of cruelty. So I don't want to dismiss, your comment. There is, but it reads like it's an accident. Yes.
I was going to say, but the first woman at the beginning of 16, how do you know she's telling the truth?
Great.
I mean, you
Right.
really don't.
Okay.
She
So
told the story, the woman rolled over on the baby, and
Right.
I mean, how does she know this happened if she was asleep, and if she was awake, why didn't she stop?
So, and it gets very complicated because the women don't have names. So I would like, just as an act of rebellion, for us to name them. So, because it's going to help us. It's going to help us follow the story better. So this first woman, somebody give me a name. Just
Hillary.
No, I'm not going to do Hillary. That's too loaded. I'm sorry.
Chelsea?
No. Gertrude? Okay, Gertrude. Great question. I don't know. And
Assume that they're Jewish women.
okay. This is Gertrude. She's the first woman. You don't like Gertrude? Okay.
How about Trudy?
Trudy? Okay, all right, Trudy. Okay, it's Trudy. Okay. And then let's name the second woman. What? Hortense? Hortense? Okay. Is that a name? Okay. Is that right? Okay. Hortense. Okay. That's good. All right. All right. Okay. So here's the question. You don't know if Trudy is telling the truth. Trudy opens the whole story, but we don't know if she's telling the truth. And in fact, if you're listening, so here's the thing. King Solomon has a wisdom that is given to him by God. Now, Rashi, when Rashi talks about this text, Rashi says that Solomon heard a bat kol, which is like an echo of God, heard God's voice, and God's voice said, this one's the mother. Now, it's strange that Rashi said that because the wisdom, as we understand the story, the wisdom comes from Solomon's incredible, brilliant decision to take out a sword and threaten to kill the baby, thus eliciting the true compassionate mother, right? But Rashi says, no, it was a bat kol. And so the question with Rashi is always, why does he do that? And the answer is because a lot could have gone wrong with Solomon. Solomon did this, and the rabbis want to say he already knew who was the mother before he did this. He did this to sort of demonstrate to those who didn't know who was the mother, but he already knew who the mother was. So how did he know it? One, rabbis say that he could read anyone's face. He could tell if you were an adulterer, he could tell if you were a liar, he could tell if you were a thief just by reading the lines on your face. But so he knew. Or maybe he knew because he had a lev shomeya, a God-given lev shomeya, a discerning, listening heart. And when he heard this story, he heard it in a deeper way than we hear it. So for example, how does this woman know what happened in the middle of the night while she was sleeping? Right? So she says, I was fast asleep. Your servant was fast asleep and it was pitch dark. And what happened was this woman rolled over and fell asleep on her baby and killed it and snuck over to me, and I didn't see anything. But yet she's telling the story. So how does she know that that's maybe perhaps a little bit suspicious. So we can perhaps question that a little. I want to think about the woman for a moment, where it says she put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. Just to get into the story, if we were to cinematography, imagine the cinematographer filming this story. Or imagine the feelings inside this woman. She wakes up. Why does she wake up? Probably because she's engorged. She needs to nurse. She's in pain, right? She finds her baby is dead, and she's also in pain. So you could even imagine. You can imagine, if she had an American lawyer, that the American lawyer would say, she hadn't intended to take the other baby. Her intention was to relieve the pressure that was causing her pain by nursing. The other woman was fast asleep. Her baby was dead. She's engorged. These women have shared everything. The whole concept of a wet nurse is totally common here. She picks up the other baby to nurse that baby, and in the process of nursing, devises this other kind of plan, doesn't want to let him go somehow. So now we go on in the story. The other woman said, no. Hortense says, no. The living one is my son. The dead one is yours. And she turns to the woman. She's talking to her now, not the king, right? But the first one insisted, no, the dead one is yours. The living is mine. And so they argued before the king.
Well, I just want to say something about Trudy. She's going to assume
Yeah.
that her friend accidentally rolled on her child.
Interesting.
She's not going to say that she deliberately killed her child and took mine.
Interesting. Right. So what does the king say? So the king then said, this one, referring to Hortense, says, my son is alive and your son is dead, right? Because it was Hortense who said, no, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours. Well, that one, Trudy, says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive. So it's good practice to repeat the argument. He's repeating the argument perhaps for those in attendance to show that he's a good judge. But also he's saying something about the argument. He dismisses the whole initial story and he just focuses on these last things that these two women said. And he points out that one of them prioritizes the living and the other prioritizes the dead. So it's actually Hortense who says, the living one is mine, and it's Trudy who says, no, the dead one is yours, right? And so that's potentially part of Solomon's, with seeing the gears of his mind working as he's figuring out what's happening. And then he says, bring me a sword. Part of me, this is where I want to go back to that compassion part, that chokhmat Adonai lasot chesed, that these women have, their only experiences of men unsheathing their swords. Let's just put it that way. That's their whole experience. And I just feel sad. I feel like at some point, I want the fatherly king, Avinu Malkeinu, to open his arms to them and just say, what a shitty life. Come here, my daughter, and just, pat on the head, a hug, I'm sorry that your baby died. I know you're not the mother. We know that you're wild with grief. Let me comfort you. But that's just my, it's a lot of swords. It's a lot of stabbing. So the king says, bring me a sword. Now, some of the rabbis point out that bring me a sword, because it's such a dangerous thing that he's doing. He knows he's not, we trust that Solomon isn't actually going to kill these babies, but it's so convincing that everyone there thinks he's going to do it. The women 100% believe that this baby is going to be cut in two. That's the world they live in, is a completely uncompassionate world. That's how they understand. They see a lot of violence. This is completely within the realm of possibility, is probable, right? But some of the rabbis point out that the king says, bring me a sword, as opposed to bringing a guard with a sword, right? He doesn't have a sword. He asks for someone to give him a sword so that he can control what happens. If he says to a guard, cut that baby in half, it's going to happen quickly and he might not be able to stop it. So that also might be part of his incredible, it all happens so fast, but there's a lot of thinking potentially that goes into it. So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave the order, cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other. That's a great point. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea.
Maybe it's just a royal decree.
Yes, maybe it's just like, let me cut this baby. I don't know. Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a good question. Who is he commanding? So there are actual laws about property. So if somebody comes to the court, two people come to the court with cloth, they're both holding the cloth, and they're both claiming that it's theirs. One of the ways to solve that dispute is to cut it in half. So he is drawing upon some laws that would actually have been known at the time, but not, with a child. Okay, so he gave the order, cut the living child in two. There's some, a lawyer, Baruch Cohen, who emailed me when this series was announced, saying he couldn't come, but he had written an article about King Solomon, and he had sent it to me, and it was great. So I'm sorry he's not here. He was sorry he couldn't come, but he had really done a lot of research on this story, and one of the things that he said, and maybe he'll watch this video, thank you, Baruch Cohen, but one of the things that he found was a text in which the rabbis actually criticize Solomon for doing this. That according to Midrash Tehillim, Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli said, "Had I been there, I would have put a cord around Solomon's neck and threatened to strangle him." That he's so upset about this. For one child dead was apparently not enough for him. He had to command that the second be divided in two. So it should elicit a kind of reaction. Now, the rabbis also imagine that at the time, because Solomon is so young, that people are saying things like, "Woe to you, O land, whose king is but a boy." The members of the court saying, "Woe to the land whose king is just a lad." But then afterwards, when they see the women's reactions, they knew that he had recently received divine inspiration, and they rejoiced and said, "Happy are you, O land, whose king is a man." So at first, everybody in the court, you can imagine, is like, "Oh, what kind of king is this? This is his first judgment, and he's insane." And I don't know how many of you have watched Game of Thrones, the title of this series. Yeah, it's not merciful. It is brutal. Right, don't fall in love with a character because they won't be there. They won't be there soon. Okay, so cut the living child in two, give half to one and half to the other. The woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." Now, so we as the reader have just been told who is the mother, right? It seems. But that doesn't mean that everyone there knows. But the other said, "Neither I nor you shall have him cut him in two." Then the king gave his ruling, "Give the living baby to the first woman, to Trudy. Do not kill him. She is his mother." One of the things you might say is that is this woman who receives the child the biological mother? So when the text says that she churned with compassion or was filled with compassion, the word for compassion in Hebrew is rachamim, which comes from the Hebrew word rechem, which means womb. So when you feel compassion, it's like you're feeling it in your womb as if towards a child of yours. And so the question is, are we identifying the woman from whose rechem this child came? Are you someone's mother because of your rechem connection? Or is this the woman whose rachamim was stirred and therefore merits mothering the child? Now, we imagine because Solomon's so wise that this is the actual mother. But I think it's an interesting question, to just think about. Yes?
So, I think that we know by name, like which one of the two?
We know.
As in whether it was the first speaker, you know what I'm saying? So you're saying for sure it was the first speaker, or who?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, you're right. It's Hortense, not Trudy.
What
Yeah,
say is
you're right. Yeah, it's Hortense. It's not the first speaker. It's not the first speaker.
the way I read this.
But it's confusing. Yes.
The way I read this is that it's trying to tell you that you don't know who is the mother, because that's why it specifically states the woman whose son was alive was filled. I don't think it would write that way if it's trying to tell you who the mother is. Actually,
Oh, that's interesting. That's a good point. Yeah.
Could you repeat it, please?
There's any one way to tell. It's impossible, in my opinion.
That it's impossible. The way the text is written, it's really hard to tell which.
So I would say
because it will say this woman, this woman, and because there's no name, right? It's ambiguous. So the way that the text is understood by the commentators, it's that the one who says, my son is alive and your son is dead, who prioritizes the living, is the mother, and that's the second woman, Well, just the going back and the dialogue going back and forth, but it is ambiguous, yes.
In 27, it says, give the living baby to the first woman, and the first woman we hear is the one who tells the story.
No. And he says
Yes,
the first
they're right.
woman, as in the woman who says, please, my Lord, give her the living baby, don't kill him.
Yeah, but you're right that it is, the author with just a couple other strokes could have made it a lot easier for us to understand. So it is ambiguous.
Whether he means
Right.
that woman or the other woman.
Right. Right. Right.
It's not ambiguous to me at all, because it's very clear that the woman wants the baby to live.
Well, yes, that part's clear. The woman who wants the baby to live gets the baby, but is that this? Yeah.
At what point in the Torah does it say choose life? Is this before, after?
That is long before. Choose life is long before.
Okay, so
Yeah.
she's choosing life.
Right. Right.
She's choosing life. She'd rather see the baby live than choosing death.
So I want to talk for a moment. Yes, and I want to talk about the woman who wants the baby cut in half.
Who's the one that got the baby? Trudy or Hortense?
Right. That's what we're trying to figure out. So most of the rabbis say Hortense. Most of the rabbis.
What human being in his her right mind would want to have the baby split? Even
Okay.
If it's my, even
Great.
If I'm not the baby, that's
Yeah.
okay. Hey, let the kid
Right.
live. I give up.
So let's talk. I want to talk about this woman. I want to talk about this woman who says, no, neither of us should have the baby. So the rabbis actually have, and this was in one of the things Baruch Cohen had sent. The rabbis asked that question, and they come up with a really wild story to answer it. One that I feel obligated to tell you, but I think is really goes a little far. So it refers back to in Leviticus, if you are married and your husband dies before you bear his children, so there's no one to carry on his name, you're obligated to marry his brother. Right. And the brother is supposed to lay with you, impregnate you so you can have a child in your brother's name, right? Now, if he refuses, then there's this whole humiliating ceremony. You take off his sandal, you shake it at him. Okay, now, according to the rabbis, if you're married and your husband passes away and he has a grandchild but not a child, you're not obligated to marry the brother, right? And there are a lot of laws about it. If you become a widow and the brother is a child, right, you are obligated to wait until he's 13 before he can make the decision to either accept this duty or not, right? So you're sort of bound to him. So we just have to hold on to all. It's a really weird explanation. So what the rabbis suggest is so bizarre, but creative. The rabbi suggests is that these women are mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. They're both widows. They kind of ignore the prostitution part. They're both widows. And so, okay. And it's let me just read it. Because you can't really make it up, right? Okay, when Solomon instructed that the living child be cut in half, and one said, this is from the Midrash, one said, give her the living child, and by no means slay him. The other should have responded, indeed, she is giving me mine. Her response, "Let it be neither mine nor yours," was senseless and reflected her foolishness. So, in fact, these two women were daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. Both of their husbands died, leaving no living children other than these two babies. The daughter-in-law's son died, and his death within 30 days of his birth would render him as a stillborn and would thus subject his mother to require yibum, which means she'd be required to marry the brother of her husband, which is this other baby. Okay. Okay. As a result, she would be required to remain single for 13 years, waiting for her mother-in-law's child to mature. She therefore swapped the living child for the dead child, claiming that the living one is hers, thereby exempting her from having to marry him. For she can claim that she has a living child and no living brother-in-law. Therefore, when Solomon said to cut the living child in half, she rejoiced, for this would truly permit her to remarry. Solomon sensed her eagerness and therefore knew to grant the living child to the mother-in-law. Okay, so, I just feel obligated to share that explanation. So if you ever find yourself in a circle talking about this, you know that story. Okay, so that's one of the rabbinic answers to the really strange idea that this woman says, cut the baby in half, neither of us. But I think there's a more human reason for it. And I think if I were to write a midrash on it, it goes back to the idea that these women, that they're prostitutes, that they were pregnant at the same time, that they had the babies at the same time, that they've lived a life of abandonment and unkindness from men. I don't think it's an accident in this story that the children are boys, and that they finally achieved this relationship that was going to be loving and good and innocent, and then one of them is abandoned, right? The baby leaves her. He dies. And all of a sudden, the equality that these two women share is destroyed. And so, in many ways, what I see is a woman who's less interested in having someone else's child. She wants her child. She's less interested in taking this other woman's baby than she is in her and the equality with her sister, right? Is that, we both have been through this, we both were pregnant, and now we both lost our babies. That's what she wants, is to have that shared relationship together, for them not to separate, So that's how I read her reaction. But any other thoughts why she would say, yes, cut the baby in half?
She was selfish and spiteful.
Okay, because she was a selfish, horrible person. Right, okay, so that's also possible. Yes.
Because it wouldn't be a good story unless she did that.
Right, that's right, okay, that's true.
I think it's very common even among men in competition. Well, I can't have it, then neither one of us
Right,
will have it.
yeah.
But this is a human being. It's not a financial issue or, a territorial issue.
Right.
I don't know.
Now, 3 days or 1 week after having a baby, are we making really good decisions? Also, just talk about rationality, yes.
Would this be relevant to the story? Would the father be the same?
Interesting. And so what would the midrash be, that if the father was the same, how would that change the story?
I don't know.
Okay.
I just thought it was an interesting idea.
Yeah.
That maybe they were impregnated by the same man.
Yeah, that is an interesting idea, and that is possible. Right. Right. One of the other things that is powerful about this story is that you have, in many ways, but let's take this woman as, let's imagine that she is cruel and selfish, and a child killer. What you have now is you have a single story that embodies the two main stereotypes of women, right? You have the virgin whore, the, you have, or you can say the, angelic and demonic, the Lilith or Eve. So you have the story of Eve. Eve is, according to the great midrash of Lilith, Adam, when he's first created, is created with Lilith, not with Eve. And Lilith is his equal. And there are lots of midrashim about Lilith. One of them is that she has wings of fire. And they argue about sex, basically. He wants to be on top, she wants to be on top. Right? That's their big argument, according to this one particular midrash. I'm glad I don't know some of these rabbis. But that's a big argument. And he says, you have to obey me. And she says, no. And he tears off her wings and throws them into the sky, and they become the sun. And she runs away from him. And he sends 3 angels after her to get her. And they say, if you don't go back to Adam and submit to him, then 1,000 of your demon children will die every day. And she hides in a cave by the Dead Sea, and she refuses to go back. And after that, he's given Eve, who also kind of deceives him, with the apple or a fig or whatever it is. But so Lilith becomes the mother of all demons. And so in a traditional Orthodox family, oftentimes after you have a baby, you hang 3 amulets over the crib with the names of those 3 angels who had been sent after Lilith. Any stillborn is blamed on Lilith. Any seminal emission in the night is because you were seduced by Lilith. So Lilith kind of represents all of that, all that we fear about womanness. Right, the seductress, the killer, and yet while Eve on the other side is mother of all life, life partner, and you have those two. And in this story as well, you have the woman who is dangerous with the children, right? Who is out of control, who is irrational and selfish. And then you have the other woman who churns with compassion. One of the other interesting things about the story is that notion that that every woman churns with compassion, right? And that if you don't churn with compassion, then you must not be the mother, right? But there are lots of different kinds of moms. There are, you can actually be an okay mom and not necessarily be maternal. You don't.
Postpartum depression could have been taking place.
And then there's postpartum depression, right, which is not accounted for here, right? Yes.
50, 60 years ago, when you had a baby, it was taken to a nursery. And you walked up to a window and you saw all these newborn babies.
Right.
Okay? And they probably all looked very, very similar. But this mother knew what her baby looked like. Even after 3 days, she could discern that there was a difference between the baby that she woke up with and the baby that she fell asleep with the night before.
Yes.
Now, that's an important point.
Well, it's interesting to imagine maybe if it's the same father, maybe they're sisters. I don't know. Maybe the babies did look very much alike. I don't know. But
she was able to see a difference.
Right. She was able to, not right away.
According to the story.
Not right away, but she was eventually able to see a difference. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Would there be punishment of the woman for lying to the king?
That's a great question. We don't hear from these women again. We don't hear what happens to the woman who was lying. There should be, throughout Torah, it talks about being a false witness. And, that you would be punished for being a false witness. So that's a really interesting question, but we don't hear about that. Yes?
Did Solomon know who was the mother before he rendered judgment?
So the rabbis believe that he did, whether it's Rashi who thought there was a voice that told him, or just because he had that divine wisdom and could read faces. So the rabbis think that he went into this already knowing. And they even go so far as to suggest that he was, because if he had just said, oh yeah, you're the mom, no one would believe him because they don't have the same wisdom that he has. And so, when he says, this one says, that one says, he's bringing everyone into his process. Yes?
I'm fascinated by you calling it a whole bot. Does that mean the voice of wisdom from above is a female voice?
Yeah, well, wisdom herself is female. And so, yes, but it's interesting. It's a bat kol, so it's the daughter of the voice, which is an interesting, I think that's also the Hebrew word for echo. It's, a daughter of a voice. But also throughout the book of Proverbs, and we know, actually Solomon is credited with the authorship of Proverbs and Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes. But throughout the book of Proverbs, wisdom is described as a woman and kind of as God's consort. It's really interesting because we're so monotheistic. But when you read Proverbs, wisdom speaks, and she says, I was with him, referring to God, before the world was created. And, you have this kind of strange, much like Greek or Roman stories of gods and their lovers birthing the world together. But yeah, wisdom is feminine. Yeah.
I think that there's so much ambiguity in this story, and I think we don't hear about the woman again or what kind of punishment, because it isn't a story about the women.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story about the wisdom that Solomon had.
Right.
All the rest is extraneous.
Right. I'm trying to change that. I actually care about the women that King Joffrey killed in Game of Thrones. What happened to them. Remember that woman? That was a horrible scene. Okay. Other thoughts about this story? Yeah.
Does God's consort have a name?
Just chokhmah. Yeah, chokhmah is wisdom. Yeah, it's the Hebrew word for wisdom. So, I guess one thing, Sandy, yes.
I'm just wondering, are there other stories about Solomon and his wisdom? Is this the only one we hear?
Well, this is the dominant story about Solomon and his wisdom. This sets the stage for, there aren't other decisions that are described that Solomon makes, right? This is the story, yes. Yes, he built the temple, yes.
It seems like from 28 that this is the one decision that makes Israel realize how wise Solomon is, which is why there are no more stories about his wisdom.
Interesting.
Because
Right.
when all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God. They saw that he had wisdom. That means that was the first time. It's not they knew,
Right.
if they recollected. They saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. That
Right.
wording says that was the first time that they saw his wisdom, and therefore they agreed.
Right.
They saw that it was right.
So we don't need any more stories.
Right, exactly.
So many of my favorite quotes are from Solomon, like nothing new under the sun.
Yes. Yes.
He's got a ton of great.
Yes. So it's interesting if this is the predominant or the only story of wisdom. It's interesting if we imagine wisdom personified, imagining wisdom as sword, baby, two crying prostitutes. But that picture is the picture of what matters ultimately, right? It's a story of life and death, basically. And not life and death at the royal level, but life and death on every level. And really, all of Judaism is ultimately about that sanctification of life. We have so many laws that are about protecting life and purifying us if it's contaminated or touched by death. So the laws of purity, the laws around menstruation are laws because menstruation is the loss of potential life. And that's why we wait traditionally, if you're Orthodox, the 7 white days before you can be touched, because that's a Shiva. That's 7 days before, you re-enter, and you enter the mikveh to purify yourself. Same if you come in contact with a corpse. You used to have to go to a mikveh. Seminal emission, although that's not really practiced today, but if one should have a nocturnal emission, that you would traditionally go to a mikveh because you've been touched by death, because that was potential life that was spilled. Same with the kosher laws. The kosher laws, dairy is life, and meat is literally dead. And so while it might be ideal to behave as we did in the garden, where every fruit and vegetable was ours to eat and there was no mention of any animals, and it wasn't until Noah sacrificed animals upon the strange thing to do when it's a limited supply. But anyway, it was at that moment where God smelled the barbecue and thought it smelled good and said, "The devisings of man's mind are evil from his youth."
Yes.
And in that moment limited man's years to 120. All kind of relating to the consumption of death. And so in the kosher laws, you separate out dairy, which is life, from that which is dead. We're maybe moved towards a time when we don't have contact with carcasses, with meat anymore. But until that time, we're going to at least acknowledge that we don't want a haphazard world where it's all just mixed together, right? So the protection and sanctification of life is at the heart of Judaism. And so here you have that in this story. You have the baby and new life. You have loss, and you have judgment. And it's really the ultimate judgment.
Is that redemption? Is that the same thing?
So how so redemption?
Somebody saying, take the baby, keep the baby. Even if it was your baby,
Right.
it was redeemed. They
Yeah.
were redeemed.
So it's basically, it's aligning yourself on the side of life, right? And that's the Jewish thing to do.
You said there were no more stories about his wisdom. How can you consider a man wise who had so many wives and concubines?
This is a good question, and I think maybe that's why he lived 52 years, right? He didn't, no, but yes.
They say he wasn't wise later on. It was not only that, he had forced labor, he raised taxes, and he subjugated people later on.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a crummy son who took over after him.
So, right, so they, yes, exactly. Right. Yes, he had, and that's basically what Ecclesiastes is about, right? Here's a person who represents it all, had, great wisdom, had, more women than anyone else, more money, and in the end, all is vanity, nothing new under the sun, and we all return to the same place. So maybe that's the ultimate wisdom. Yes.
You can also say that he had that many wives and whatnot, and he took care of them, and they who knows?
Well, I think he had 1,000 wives. It's hard to take care of that many. Yeah.
No, I mean financially, not
Right.
physically, but the thing is, you would think back in the day, who knows what would happen to you if you didn't get married, and back then the male was 100% responsible financially, so who knows what would have happened to many females who didn't get married, So it
Right.
seems like he helped them at least give them the essential, you would think, I would think,
That kind of culture is so foreign to how we live that it's very difficult to talk about. It's very hard.
Right now, that
Right.
doesn't apply, but back then, you would
Yeah, because the next holiday we have is Purim, which is really a story of sex trafficking And and we tell the story as as this kind of beautiful story of this girl who rescues her people, but essentially she, along with all of the beautiful virgins in the land, are you could go so far as to say probably raped by the king, and then sequestered to his harem. Only she was asked back. But always terrified. Every time she entered his room, she waited to see if he would raise the golden scepter, and if he didn't, she's dead. So that's not really a loving relationship. It's a terrible story. But you are right in that we don't know. There are people who write about academically polygamous societies where they say that when a woman becomes a widow, even at an older age, in polygamous societies, they can be welcomed in as a sister wife, not even as a sexual partner, but just they're suddenly in a protected household under the protection of that ring and what that means. So it's hard for us to talk about because it's just so far away and it has so many negative connotations for us. Yes.
In defense of King Solomon, with his multiple wives and slave labor and taxes, et cetera, he wasn't breaking any laws. No. It was the times that they lived in.
Right. Yes. That is true.
He also married foreign wives who had political reasons. For political reasons, but they
right. But they caused him to stray a little bit from God. Right, because they introduced their gods to him and he was seduced away. So I want us to just imagine if you're the one sitting on that throne and these are the people who come before you, just as one of our last exercises together, what is your, do you take out the sword? If we put ourselves in the story, how do we maybe see the story through Chochmat Adonai Lasot Chesed? How do we bring Chesed, loving kindness, mercy into this story? Or is there no better way than what Solomon did?
Yeah.
No better way.
It was just
Yes. Okay. The most direct and frightening way is the sword. Yeah. Lisa. Okay, all right, good. So how about a co-parenting model? Right, because, these are women who are living in the same house.
But it wasn't offered.
Right, it wasn't offered. So if the cleanest, clearest, most dramatic way is with the sword, it's interesting for us to think about how we apply that to situations today. Not in our personal lives, but just on a grander scale. How do we, for us, the lev shomea, the concept of a listening heart, is a very gentle, kind of open, feeling heart. But there's a way to have a soft heart and a tough skin at the same time. And perhaps we have to think about when are we a listening heart in that we are a soft, pliable heart, and when are we a listening heart where we're listening for truth and judgment and we can muster the strength of decision that is often needed. Yes.
I wouldn't be so pleasant. If I thought that was my baby, I would just do everything. I mean.
Yes. If that she would not be pleasant if she thought that someone had her baby, you would do everything.
Right.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So life comes before anything, and if you have to use the sword to protect life, life comes before everything. Yes?
Because you save a person, you save
And it's interesting that in Judaism, as much as we talk about everyone being made B'Tselem Elohim in God's image, the life of the assailant is not considered equal to the life of the pursuant. So the life of the person who is seeking to harm you or to kill you is no longer as valuable as your life. And you're supposed to do everything you can to stop that person. So we have this notion of justice and of the sword, even mixed in with that heart that we try to display. So that's our story.
Power and the powerless.
Yes, yes. It's really amazing that this is the story that defines his wisdom, and it comes from these two people. So I hope that Trudy and Hortense sort of become part of our matriarchal history. And I thank you for the opportunity to learn with you.